In a quarter mile, merge onto I-74.
Of course, I would pick a rainy day to come out here. So I'm at the site of the decommissioned Chanute Air Force Base in Rantoul, Illinois, named for Octave Chanute. I used to think that this was Chanute Air Force Base, named for Claire Chanute of the Flying Tigers. So for a very long time, I didn't even have the name of this place correct. The significance of this place for me is that this is where I would have gone to school if I had been in air operations as a meteorologist. But when I enlisted, there were no openings there, so I took the best job in the Marine Corps, Aviation Ordnance. So I went to training in Millington, Tennessee, and then later Camp Pendleton, California. So this is the first time I've ever been here, and unfortunately, I won't be able to film the aviation museum that used to be here. From what I read on the internet, it was something else because that's been closed. However, I thought I would do some driving and walking around the base to see how it's been repurposed. So in addition to coming out here to film the base, I was also coming out here to do some rail fanning. But as I was coming up the highway, I noticed that there were maintenance of way crews at a crossing, and it looked like there was an excavator there. So more than likely it's been ripped up and there won't be any traffic. I might go to check to see if the block signals are showing any traffic. Maybe they only ripped up one of the two tracks, but I don't think I'm going to be doing any rail fanning out here today. So I'm sure there were a lot of buildings here that just got knocked down. It wasn't a very big base. This to me looks like it could be Barracks. Yeah, you can see the windows have been smashed out, at least for some of the rooms. Everything's kind of overgrown. Yeah, this could have been where they had a formation, or this could just be where maybe they set up some picnic tables or something. Let's just look into one of these broken windows here. You can see there's curtains, mattresses, there's a door. Yeah, this was a barracks. Man, look at that. They had carpet. The Air Force gets freaking carpet. We had tile floors that we had to wax and buff. That building there in the foreground kind of looks like a chapel to me. And then behind that, it could be more barracks. Could be a chow hall or something over there. So over here we have what looks like could have been a basketball court maybe, and over there those townhouse looking structures, that's base housing, probably enlisted housing. They would have townhouses or duplexes in some cases. Sometimes they'd put 4 single level homes together. I guess it'd be a quad or something like that, and then it'd be a parking lot in the middle. So in addition to having barracks for the people that worked on base, they had to have barracks for all the students that were coming here for training. And then the base housing was separated into officers, which got nicer base housing, enlisted, which would have been, there might have been a division between, say, your non-rates and your NCOs and staff NCOs. You know, rank has its privileges. Just really depends. The Air Force and the Army had a lot more budget for base housing than the Marine Corps did. Yeah, you can see these are barracks. There's the ladder well up to the 2nd and 3rd floor, and over there you can see that water tower there. They would use industrial size air conditioning for these buildings. We had that at NAS Memphis in Millington, Tennessee. Ours were bigger, but it's pretty much a similar layout. You see there's more base housing in the back. They boarded up some of these windows. That's probably a good idea. Want an old Air Force barracks? Contact your Coldwell Banker real estate agent. So although I was never stationed here, I've been on enough military bases over the course of my life, and the layout, especially the older bases, is similar. I don't necessarily mean that everything was arranged identical at every base, but certain things would be near certain other things, or certain things would have a certain appearance. This here is either the bowling alley or the theater, probably the bowling alley. And over here you can see there's more base housing. See, they got the jungle gyms for the kids in between. Based on all the vehicles parked here, my guess is that they've repurposed these into townhouses, which I think is great. Why let it go to waste? John E. Bowerman Memorial Parade Ground. Now this is all grass. And you can have a parade ground that's grass, but the bases I was stationed on, they were asphalt, called it the parade deck. The guys older than me called it the grinder. But you could do this in a grassy field. I'm not saying we didn't have any grassy fields. I remember seeing the Marine Corps band perform out in a grassy field once instead of on the parade deck. 99th Pursuit Squadron at Chanute Field. And across the street, that is definitely a chapel. So I don't know if they had two on this base or if the other building was something else. It just kind of looked like a small chapel. On the bases I was stationed on, the chapel would hold services for different religions. I only remember ever seeing one on each base. So, you know, at 0800 there'd be a service for this faith, and at 0900 there'd be a service for this faith, and 1000 hours a service for this faith, something like that. So they would just use the same building for multiple denominations, and really the services that were held were based on, you know, how many chaplains we had and all that. We didn't always have a chaplain for every denomination. So yeah, I don't know if that's how they did it here, but a lot of things in the military were the same or are the same, just call it by a different name. Okay, so based on the appearance of the building, its location, and the really big flagpole in front, I'm going to say this was headquarters. If it wasn't headquarters, then it was air operations, but that should be out on the flight line, or normally it would be out on the flight line. Yeah, see, here on the sign it says Command Center. So yeah, this is the headquarters building. And that base housing looks a little bit nicer, so that could be where the officers had their base housing. Here, let's go up the steps. Can't really see anything in there. So you can't really see anything inside, but it's probably all offices and conference rooms, that sort of thing. All right, so I'm not really sure what exactly this monument is, but this fenced in area with the benches, and I guess these could also be considered benches. They don't have any backs to them. They look more like tables, but this is an area, there's a trash can overflowing, but this is an area that at Marine Barracks, we would call this the beer garden. And it's literally an area where you could maybe come out and have some drinks, do a cookout, something like that. Just some sort of after hours kind of thing for the people in the barracks or for the squadron or something like that. You've got some sort of monument here. We will have turned the corner when we reach the point where others turn and regard us as pace setters. Maybe that fell off. So it's kind of a triangular shaped curved rock wall with a bird of prey in flight on one side and a bird of prey perched on the other side. The other side is all stone. The base of it is really thick timbers, kind of in a conical shape. So the bird that is perched Kind of looks like the owl from Clash of the Titans. So ahead you can see a hangar that's been repurposed. Maverick pipe. It's probably a warehouse or manufacturing facility. Hangars are huge and they can hold a lot of weight on the floor, so they could very easily be repurposed into a factory or warehouse or something like that. There's another hangar there in front of it, that rectangular building with all of the plywood over what look like loading docks. That's probably supply. You would have supply for the aircraft parts, and then you'd have supply for everything from ballpoint pens to uniforms to you name it. Down there, that building, the water tower in the background, that's probably the fire department. Would have been AFFR, Air, Fire, Crash and Rescue. Over here you can see another long rectangular building with the loading docks all boarded up. Some more supply and a hangar in the background. This building here with the multiple floors could have been a school. Since I did training on this base, they could have different classrooms in there. Or it could be another barracks. It could be a BEQ, that's the Bachelor Enlisted Quarters. So sometimes the married guys who didn't have their families with them because they were there temporarily or there were other circumstances, they'd get a little bit nicer barracks. Or in some cases, the entire floor of one of the barracks would just be BEQs. And our rules weren't as strict. You know, we all had wives and kids, so we all knew how to tidy up and that sort of thing. We were a little bit more accountable than the single guys, so we just had we had some different rules in ours, and I'm sure some others were like that too. More base housing down here. Like I said, that's probably for officers. It's a duplex. And it's got multiple floors, and it looks like each one of them has like a little attached room that could be it could be an extra room or something like that. But the officers got something a little bit nicer. And this isn't the way it was on every base. Depending on the size of the base, how much room they could put in for base housing, and also the budget. The Air Force had a lot of base housing and nicer base housing because they had a bigger budget. Because, you know, they got bombers and fighters and nuclear missiles. So with whatever it is you're doing, you get a budget attached to that. So the less stuff you're doing, the less people you have on your base, the smaller budget you have, the less you have in your budget for base housing. Sometimes base housing would be located off base as well. It would be government property and would be controlled by the military police or by the commanding general of the base, but it might not be in with everything else. It just depended on what the military had set up, because when a lot of these bases were built, the land wasn't as developed as it is today, so land was a lot easier to acquire and a lot easier for the military to set things up back then. So when I showed up to Marine Corps Air Station New River, North Carolina back in '93, there wasn't any base housing for enlisted people on the air station. So I had to apply for base housing at Camp Lejeune next door, which was pretty big. And when I got there, they said, we're full. There are no openings right now. So I had to go out in town and rent a place. And sometimes that happens just because you're in the military and just because you're married or have a kid or kids, because your dependent does not necessarily have to be a spouse. You aren't necessarily guaranteed base housing. And let's say you move up in ranks, but there's no openings for nicer base housing. You get on a waiting list, more or less. Now this says Grissom Hall, So I'm guessing that's maybe Gus Grissom, not sure, but Grissom Hall, and that looks like a supply depot. So I don't know why it would be called that. If that's supposed to be their chow hall, that most definitely does not look like a chow hall. If it's some sort of meeting space, it doesn't look like that either, but it could have looked a lot different years ago. Yeah, loading docks and whatnot. This is all supply. That building right there, that kind of outbuilding with the pipes and whatnot coming out of it, going into the other building, that would have been some sort of utility for this. It could have been power generation or some other thing, you know, a pump or air compressor, something like that. You can see chillers on the roof there for air conditioning. Same thing over here. Everything's on an industrial scale. And that building straight ahead, that's got to be air operations. Looks like what would be a tower on there. And just the layout, the size, or it's, if it's not a repurposed, or they didn't repurpose the air operations building, then they just built that, but it's laid out a lot like air operations would be. Some of them on the smaller bases are smaller, but it's still kind of a multi-floor building where they've got offices downstairs and it's connected to a tower or next to the tower. There's a hangar there, but that looks newer. So with this hangar here and those fuel trucks there and this fence here with the sign that says restricted area, keep out, I'm gonna guess that this is an active airport. I mean, why let the runway go to waste? There you can see the doors for the hangar. They've got the height and width for the doors above them. Now the B-52s had a cutout in the top for the tail, so I doubt they put B-52s in there. Not really sure what all they had here other than, I guess, pursuit fighters in World War II. That hangar has been repurposed because those loading docks that are in front of one of the doors, or half of the doors, because the doors are kind of telescoping, you can see they're staggered, so each one opens into the next. So that's not standard. That was added after the fact. So that building's probably been repurposed into a warehouse. And that in the background that looks like scaffolding, that could have been where the radar was. So it looks like it's a child care center now. I'm not really sure what that is, but this could very easily be a new built or newer building, or just a heavily remodeled air operations building. This would be the right spot for air operations. So yeah, Rise Academy, Rantoul City Schools. So I'm going to say this has been repurposed. Okay, this is what I was talking about with the other hangars not having a cutout. This hangar does. It's much taller. You can see here, I'll zoom in on it. See that cutout in the center above the door? That's for the tail of a B-52. So you could probably put a buff in here. If it wasn't for a B-52, then maybe it was a KC-135, but that's how you can tell if the hangar was set up for a really large aircraft. All right, so I believe I'm on the north side of what I'm going to call the air operations building. They've got a fenced in area back here with picnic tables, so this might be someplace for like a recess area for the kids. I'm going to walk up here to the fence. It's got barbed wire along the top. Restricted area, keep out. You can see, let me see if I can zoom in on it. Not too well through this fence. All right, there we go. I had to slide it through the fence. You can see the windsock out there. Approaching the Maverick Pipe building, you can see they've remodeled one side of the hangar. So it's modern. It looks like the modern front of a factory. A couple floors or vaulted ceilings. Probably offices and conference rooms. Looks like a place I would work at. And it sounds like one too, because there's a clanging sound coming from inside the hangar. That's probably a stamping press. Another thing these long buildings that are attached to the hangars could be, if they aren't supply, then they could be intermediate level maintenance. So there's 3 levels. Organization, that's out on the flight line, out on the flight deck, out on the front lines, working on the aircraft directly. Then there's intermediate, and that's the shops that rebuild the stuff. So you take the engine out of the aircraft, that's organizational, and then you hand it off to intermediate, who would inspect it or rebuild it or something like that. And then there's depot level, which is usually civilian contractors and very few military people. And that's where you strip the aircraft down to a frame and rebuild it from the ground up. Either modifying it to bring it up to current standards, there's been some changes or something, or just as regular, what they call phase maintenance. All aircraft, civilian and military, go through different stages of maintenance where at one point you will strip the thing down to a frame, inspect everything, replace what needs to be replaced, and put it all back together and recertify it. And everything's documented, so you can keep track of all the parts you put on it, when maintenance was done, if it was done, because if you're missing maintenance, that's a safety issue. Aircraft are maintained to a standard much higher than automobiles. So this could be those shops where they do the teardowns and rebuilds and inspections. And that might have been attached to the same squadron that handled supply. In the Marine Corps it was. I don't know how they do it in the Air Force. And this looks familiar. He's delivering plastic pellets for injection molding. Those handles underneath, you'll open it up, and then the plastic in that section will get vacuumed, or, well, yeah, more or less vacuumed into the building. And then you close that valve and you open the next one, and so on and so forth. So the pellets would come in on a rail car in bulk, and then the truck would hook up to the rail car and actually vacuum the pellets out of the rail car, drive to the customer, and then hook up to the customer, and they would get vacuumed into what's called a dry. Well, they'd go into a silo here, and then later go into what's called a dryer, and then eventually end up in the injection molding machine for processing. See, the sign says bulk resin fill. So, yep. Looks like a dust collector over there. So maybe they do plastic pipe here, or a combination of plastic and metal. You can see up in that open window, they've opened up some of the top windows for ventilation. You might be able to see it. That's one of those big ass fans. That's literally what it's called. That's the name brand of it. And it circulates the air throughout the building. You wouldn't believe how much that helps. Even if it's warm in there, just having the air circulating just kind of helps cool everybody off. You see the numbers on some of the buildings. All the buildings on the base are going to be numbered. Everything is in an orderly, proficient military manner. It might not make sense to some, but for certain, if you look at it a certain kind of way, that's why the military is so orderly, or at least it used to be. All right, here we go. This covered structure with a couple picnic tables in it. Once again, I go back to the beer garden reference. 3340. So 3,340th Tech Training Group. So this would have been like their break area. So maybe they repurposed some of the supply or intermediate level maintenance spaces into classrooms, because when I was in Millington, we had actual classrooms. It looked like a public school type classroom, and then we'd go out into the hangar where we would work on the simulators and trainers, and it was set up a lot like what we had once we got out in the fleet. So they could have done the same thing here, depending on what training was done. Like I said in the beginning, the only thing I was aware of was the meteorology school that I could have gone to. But I'm kind of glad that I ended up doing what I did. Because also, like I said in the beginning of the video, it's the best job in the Marine Corps. If you've ever seen an acronym, IYAOYAS, that's an aviation ordnance acronym, Navy Marine Corps aviation ordnance acronym. IYAOYAS. If you ain't ordnance, you ain't shit. No truer words could be spoken. Now, I don't remember if the Air Force did it, but the Marine Corps would paint the water towers on base, and there would be several. They would paint them in a checkerboard pattern, kind of a bright orange and white checkerboard pattern. It's high visibility. So I don't know if this one was painted like that or something else and then it got repainted. You can see the building off to the left of it. It's probably some sort of utility type waterworks or something like that for the base. In some cases, the bases would have, I can hear the train. So one of the tracks is active. That's the way it works in rail fanning. Sometimes you're out there and you catch something and sometimes you just miss it. But the bases, some of them would have their own power generation or partial power generation and utilities, water and that sort of thing. And sometimes they would rely on something out in town, a combination of the two. Really with the older bases, with everything being a lot smaller, it was a lot easier to put things on base and just handle it that way. Also, it gave them a level of security. If something failed out in town, it didn't necessarily fail on base. And for national defense purposes, you want to be up and running 100% as often as possible. You want to be ready at a moment's notice. That's part of the reason why we spend so much on our military. People may not understand that, but believe it or not, some things the military pays a lot less for than civilians do. And with older bases like this, it's not like they've got to purchase land at current prices. So some of the things that are still being used by the military years later have paid for themselves over and over again. Yeah, you can see the numbers on the doors. This was a fire department. I'm sure some bases probably had regular firefighting, and then they had firefighting by the flight line, but others probably combined the two. I believe we combined the two on New River. I mean, look at that. Officers lived good. They even get a garage in the back. So whether you're living in the barracks or you're living in base housing, it might seem kind of ratty and kind of dumpy. And granted, this is an example of a much older style. I mean, we're talking about 40s, 50s, 60s, right through here. Actually, all throughout the base. The bases have been remodeled in some cases, and the barracks have been remodeled or torn down and rebuilt. The barracks that I stayed in at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego, were being built when my dad was in boot camp. He was in aluminum or steel Quonset huts out on our parade deck, whereas we at least had multi-floor buildings. They weren't air conditioned, or at least they didn't turn on the air conditioning, but yeah, times change. I remember when I went to Cherry Point in 1993, I had to go from New River to Cherry Point, take some gear down there to be calibrated, and I saw how much they had remodeled the shops out on the flight line and how much they had remodeled the barracks. They were much nicer looking buildings, looked more like a modern hotel from the outside, things like that. So things have improved as far as the quality of living, but just the fact that these structures are still here can give somebody an idea about what it was like to be in the military during the Cold War. That's why I'm going to include this video in my Cold War playlist. I grew up during the Cold War. I enlisted at the very tail end of the Cold War, and I remember what it was like back then. And for some people, they weren't alive for that, or their memories aren't so good. So that's why I have the playlist. I try to release one video a month. Sometimes I do more than that, but it's just something. Maybe it's an airplane, maybe it's a missile, maybe it's me walking around a deactivated or decommissioned Air Force base, but it's something just to kind of remind people or let people know what it might have been like, or what was out there, or what was being tried, or why we were spending so much money on our national defense, or just how things were. Things I remember as a kid. And no matter what branch you served in, or how long you served, whether you're active, reserves, whether you were in a combat zone or you were in some air-conditioned office stateside, we were all part of it, and we were all cogs and gears and moving parts in a machine that has maintained the safety and security of this country. And for somebody who hasn't served, or maybe somebody who has a such a negative experience while they were in, that they don't look at it the same way as other veterans. It might be difficult to understand, but there's a reason why we have the military that we do, that we have, and there's a reason why bases like this existed in the past. That over there might be the commanding general's home, maybe. And that's why we still need military bases today, and we need our national defense today still. Words can only convey so much if you weren't there, if you didn't do it. And that's why I think preserving our history with landmarks and museums, memorials, or even things like books, websites, and YouTube videos, it's a great way that we can always have a point of reference to look back at and just see where we've been as a nation, not just from a military standpoint, but really just overall, and how far we've come. Sometimes, in order to look towards the future, it's a good idea to analyze the past and try to analyze it objectively. If you don't know, find out. Don't just assume that, well, because it's this way today, that it's got to be that way back then, because that's not necessarily the truth. And there's a lot of history out there. Look at this old water fountain, or what we would call a scuttlebutt in the Marine Corps and Navy. And here is the site of the Chanute Air Museum, as I miss another passing train. The door was open or unlocked. Wow. Yeah, lots of graffiti and vandalism. Well, it's all gone now. Over here could have been a lot of different things. That could have been the PX, the Rantel Public Library, could have been the base library, or it could have been something else. You could have child care right there, like a preschool. Could have had commissary. There would have been a gas station on base. If the base was big enough, they might have had a public school. Kind of like a small city. This small building over here could have been the base post office. I've seen some bases that have had a main post office and then had like a small post office in the headquarters building or something like that. This fitness center here could have been the base gym. You got a bunch of young guys, maybe they did sports in high school, or they're just bored all the time looking for something to do. What better thing to do than to go work out, get physically fit, stay physically fit. It's good for somebody in the military. Plus, it's just a kind of a great way to kind of keep people on base where they're not getting into trouble and burning off some of that energy and boredom and spending the time in a useful fashion. It's one thing I remember is MWR, Morale, Welfare, and Recreation, had all kinds of different activities for us on base to keep us busy, because there's a lot of hurry up and wait in the military. So you might be working at a crazy pace, and then next thing you know, you got a ton of downtime. And I remember being young, it was a lot easier to get bored. So we had gyms all over the place, but we had lots of other activities, as well as things that you could do with your family. You know, some bases, they've got fishing on base. Remember my dad was stationed at a base that had horse stables. So different things you can do, and you can stay on base and you can do them fairly inexpensively because military pay isn't very good, or even for free. A lot of bases have golf courses, movie theater, bowling alley, library. There's some air traffic out of here. This building across the street could have been the post office too. And this building kind of looks like it was the credit union maybe. Even though there's ruined buildings, torn down sites, and new construction out here, and I may not have gotten all of the buildings correct. I didn't even see a base hospital, or if they had a clinic, which would have been called a dispensary on some bases. Not a dispensary like what you guys think of today, but I didn't even see some of the structures that probably would have been here. It still gives somebody an idea about what it would have been like on a military base in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. Eventually, all of this history will get torn down, and it'll be replaced or repurposed with something else. Thanks for watching.